The autonomic nervous system, our way of controlling all the things that we essentially don't need to process within the conscious body itself. And so the autonomic nervous system is a series of nerves, both incoming and outgoing sensory and motor information, that is going to allow us to adjust just about everything that is internal within the body. And so this is all of our homeostatic balances within the body itself. Everything from the ability to control cardiovascular to controlling the body as far as the respiratory, digestion, anything and everything, essentially internal organ system and processes are going to be there for the sympathetic nervous system. This is working within and with the somatic nervous system as well. And so the somatic side of things is getting information in and processing that information at the same time. So the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system both lie within the peripheral nervous system. And so the somatic side is going to give us our conscious control. We're going to know about different things. And a lot of the autonomic system, the ANS, is both going to be unconscious as far as the sensory side, as well as being involuntary in terms of its control. So somatic system is all of our conscious sensory information. And so this is conscious somatic sensory, so everything that is essentially coming from the skin itself, as well as all of our special senses and information that we're getting from it. And then we also have our proprioceptive information that is coming in about the body position at any given time. And then on the motor side, we send that information out to skeletal muscle only. The autonomic nervous system receives information from essentially all internal neurons and receptors, and this information brings that information in, and we're then able to process it, decide what we need to do, and it's going to send its motor side out to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, as well as glands. And so depending upon what we need to do in order to maintain homeostasis, that same process is going to be done as well. For the somatic side of things, we have a series that we saw back when we talked about skeletal muscle and the nervous system. We have upper motor neurons and we have lower motor neurons. And so the upper motor neurons are going to be sending information down from the brain, and that innervation is going to come down and then synapse on the lower motor neuron. When we have a reflex going on, we have a situation where we have the sensory information coming in from the sensory receptor, and so that information is going to come into the cord, synapse on an interneuron, go right back out that lower motor neuron, and come to the muscle itself. For our autonomic side, we have information where we now change kind of the makeup a little bit. And so we still have a sensory neuron coming in that sends the information into the cord. But then coming out of the cord, we're not going to have just a single neuron like we do for the somatic side. We have two neurons. And so the first neuron comes out, and so we have what we call a preganglionic neuron. And then we have a postganglionic neuron. And so the preganglionic neuron gets us out to an autonomic ganglion, and that ganglion is going to be where we have then the cell bodies of our postganglionic neurons, and those then go out to the effector organ themselves. And so two neurons in the pathway for autonomics and only a single neuron for the pathway for motor on the somatic side of things. And so this autonomic process involves a preganglionic neuron and then a postganglionic neuron. And so we have preganglionic, we have postganglionic, and then somewhere in between we have the ganglion itself. And so this is where that connection is going to be made. This ganglion may be very close to the spinal cord, and the ganglion may be close to the effector organ, depending upon the type of information that is going out from the autonomic nervous system itself. And so the autonomic nervous system is not just a single pathway in a sense where Somatic side is essentially just sensory information in and skeletal muscle motor out. And we're going to be able to essentially turn on that skeletal muscle or inhibit it, and that process is all that we have. For the autonomics, we have parasympathetics, and then we have sympathetics. And so we have two separate divisions for them. They are going to be antagonistic of one another. And so one, in a sense, is going to bring things up, and the other is going to bring them back down. And so they have dual innervation to essentially all of the effector organs themselves. And so they're going to have their information traveling depending upon which one is predominating at that particular time that is there. All of them have, again, two neurons, and so they're going to have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron that's there. And depending upon which system we have, determines where we find those ganglia themselves that are there. Both are involuntary. We don't have any control over the two, and they're, again, working to maintain that homeostatic balance that we have. So for our autonomic systems themselves, we have the sympathetic side, and then we have the parasympathetic side. For the sympathetic side, we have a sympathetic chain, and so we have this trunk that is here running along the thoracic vertebrae, and so this is going to run along that area there and innervate the particular level that we need to. And so all sympathetic information, and so sympathetic information is our so-called fight or flight. This is information that is going to do things like raise heart rate, raise breathing rate, decrease digestive system itself in terms of its function, versus the parasympathetic side. Its information comes from either the cranial nerves, and so we have brainstem innervation here from the cranial nerves, or we have information coming down from the sacral area as well. And so we have these sacral region and then the pelvic splanchnic nerves exiting and sending information for parasympathetics as well. So the parasympathetic side of things is rest and digest. And so this is going to be decreasing heart rate, decreasing respiratory rate, increasing digestion, increasing urine output, things like that. Versus the sympathetics was fight or flight, and it goes all in the opposite direction on there that we can see within the system itself. And so it's just going to be the opposite of what we have for parasympathetics. The majority of the time, we are in a parasympathetic state. And so the majority of the time, the parasympathetic state is going to dominate over that of the sympathetics. So here we can see the difference in terms of the preganglionic and postganglionic for our parasympathetics and sympathetics. So in the parasympathetic side, the preganglionic neuron is long, and so the ganglion itself is actually going to be right near the effector organ, versus the sympathetics, the preganglionic is short, and that autonomic ganglion is going to be essentially right outside of the thoracic cord. And so it's going to lie just outside of the spinal cord itself. And then we have a long postganglionic to go out to the organ itself. Versus the parasympathetics, we have a short postganglionic neuron. And that postganglionic neuron is essentially just either from just outside of the organ or from even just in the organ itself. So the parasympathetics are, again, rest and digest. And so this is our rest and digestion process, essentially keeping the body conserving energy, doing the things that it needs to in order to repair, in order to get the nutrients that it needs into the body that is there. And so when we're doing things at rest, parasympathetics are going to be in control. Our parasympathetics are going to do things in the way that is opposite of sympathetics. So we're going to decrease heart rate. We're going to decrease our respiratory rate as well. We're going to constrict the airways. We're going to constrict the pupils. We don't need to get as much information coming in from sensory when we're in parasympathetic as we do for that of the sympathetics, where we want as much information as possible in order to get that there. The sympathetics then are our fight or flight. And so these are going to become increased when we have stresses on the body. That stress could be perceived stress. And so it could be things like just the stress of work, of the everyday, got to pay the bills, got to get things done, work-related, things like that. But they can also be true physical stress things as well. And so where we have the body under stress because we're possibly sick, because we have some sort of injury, things like that, we're going to be in this sympathetic state. With that, we're going to have this emergency situation kind of happening, and so things are going to go up for the most part. And so we're going to elevate our blood pressure, heart rate, breathing rate, and depth is going to go up. All of those respiratory airways are going to dilate, get as much air in as possible. That is there. The pupils are going to now dilate, and so they're going to open up to try and get in as much information as possible into the body itself. Our skeletal muscles are going to become tense. They may even, depending upon what's happening at the time, they may even start to shake because they're kind of on edge in a sense, and so they're primed and ready to go at that point. And with that, we're going to have an additional set of hormones that are coming out, which is going to do things like decrease pain, have a sense of euphoria to where we don't kind of know necessarily that there's imminent danger, perhaps, depending upon the situation, of course, that is there. So the sympathetics then, they have their ganglion right outside of the thoracics. And so these are coming right outside of the thoracic cord, and they're exiting along there, and we have that ganglion sitting right next to the actual cord itself. The majority of all of our organs have dual innervation. So since one side brings things up and the other side brings things down, we need to be able to innervate them with both divisions. And so both of the sympathetics and parasympathetics are going to be innervating the majority of all of our actions that are there. If one is going up, the other one is going to bring it down. So they're generally opposing each other. And so we're going to have opposite effects of each one that is there. The plexi themselves innervate from different areas to different portions of the body itself. And so their pathways that to get there are slightly different. They both utilize a set of neurotransmitters. And so we have specific neurotransmitters that are active for parasympathetics and specific ones active for sympathetics as well. And their receptors are then going to be different within each side also. So our neurotransmitters that we utilize for the autonomic side is either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. And so these are going to come out of those presynaptic neurons and then bind to the postsynaptic cell that's there. And depending upon the receptor that we have dictates the type of effect that we get. And so it can be either excitatory or inhibitory depending upon the receptor. And so it's receptor dependent as far as the type of outcome that we get for them. So for the parasympathetic division, both the preganglionic and the postganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine. And so their neurotransmitter of choice is acetylcholine. And so these neurons are said to be cholinergic types of neurons. And so the preganglionic axon and the postganglionic axons for the sympathetic side are going to use cholinergic neurotransmitters as well and have cholinergic cells, except that on the postganglionic side, only a few of the postganglionic axons are using cholinergic receptors. For the most part, they're going to use adrenergic. And so we're going to use norepinephrine rather than the acetylcholine. So autonomic reflexes work similar to that of our skeletal reflexes in terms of the process that is happening there. And so we have a process where we have sensory information coming in that then goes in and gets processed, and then we send that information back out through specific pathways, either increasing things or decreasing things, depending upon which way we're going. Is it a parasympathetic or an autonomic or a sympathetic response that are there? And so that's going to do things within the body itself to control smooth muscle contractions, control cardiovascular contractions, control the secretions of different glands. All gets controlled by these autonomic reflexes. So one example is urination or micturition. And so as the bladder fills, it ends up pushing out on the walls of the bladder. And so it's stretching the bladder itself. That information is then received by sensory neuron. That information comes into the cord. It synapses on the interneuron there. That interneuron is then going to send out a motor response. And so that motor response here is then going to send down information. So we have our preganglionic neuron. And since the ganglion itself is at the organ, so it's at the bladder itself, we know that this is a parasympathetic type of response. And one going over here on there. And as it stimulates then the smooth muscle, it synapses on the ganglion. Our post-ganglionic neurons then stimulate the smooth muscle within the bladder to start to contract. This then also stimulates other muscles, and so in terms of essentially holding urine in, we have a set of sphincters. And so we have an internal urethral sphincter. This one needs to relax. The external needs to relax as well. But if a person is potty trained, they're going to have control over that external sphincter, but not the internal one. And so the internal one is part of the reflex itself. The external one is not. And then if you're, in a sense, ready to go to the bathroom, then that allows the urine to exit from the bladder. Ultimately, everything is essentially controlled by the central nervous system. And so the autonomic function itself is not entirely independent, so to speak. It may be entirely involuntary, but it's not working on its own in terms of the reflexes themselves. And so we do have areas of the central nervous system from the cerebrum, hypothalamus, brainstem, and spinal cord influencing what is going on within the autonomic function itself that is there. And so the hypothalamus, back when we talked about the brain, we said was the master control. And so that hypothalamus is working to control things through the autonomic nervous system. And so this is going to be everything from things like, especially on the emotional side of things, everything from satiety to hunger. And so the two sides of that. And so going along with that, with satiety, we would have information being sent out as far as pleasure. And then on the hunger side, we would have potential rage going out on the hypothalamic side of the system there as well. That information then comes in, and we're getting information from sensory information, so potentially about smells and taste and things like that, visual cues as well. That information gets processed through the thalamus up to the cortex, and then eventually directly affects the hypothalamus. And then we're going to affect the autonomic function from there. The brainstem has neurons that are coming in for sensory information as well. And this is going to be primarily through the cranial nerves. And so this information is going to send out the motor side of things through the parasympathetics, the largest one being that of the vagus nerve. And then the vagus nerve is going to control all of our internal organs for parasympathetics. The information that is being processed here as well, we have different reflex centers, especially within the brainstem itself, for everything from vision. and so are affecting vision. So things like accommodation of the lens, and so changing based upon whether we're looking at things close up or far away, changing the size of the pupils that is there for vision, reflexes as far as vestibular information is concerned, changes within both our pons medulla are working on cardiovascular, respiratory changes that are there. Medulla vagus nerve is digestion. All those kinds of processes are being functioned within the brainstem itself. And so we have all of those primary centers for control within the brainstem. And so they're either within the midbrain, the pons, or the medulla, controlling everything from cardiovascular to respiratory to digestion to urine production. Anything and everything, in a sense, is being controlled within those areas that are there. When we have things like defecation and urination, so for the digestive tract and the urinary tract for their final output of product, so to speak, those levels, again, can be influenced by higher centers. And so since we become potty trained, we have the ability to inhibit those reflexes. And so we can use those outer sphincters to be able to control the process itself and kind of override those processes or the reflexes as they would normally want to do. Other reflexes we just can't overcome. And so we're not going to be able to inhibit those reflexes that are there. So kind of at the level of control type of thing as well, we have at the spinal cord level, we have autonomic reflexes for things like urination and defecation. We have brainstem having large amount of control over all of our internal organ information, but it's going to be influenced by the hypothalamus, and it's going to send its information on down from there. And then the cerebrum can start to override things like our need for defecation and urination, and even at times can influence things like respiration. And so we can change those processes there as well. And so autonomics are really our central control for all of our internal organ processes, the things that we just don't want to, in a sense, have to spend all of our time thinking about throughout the day.